What silence lingers when a coffin hides more than death? It was the year 1858, and in the small town of Lowell, Massachusetts, a whisper of unease drifted among the brick mills and cobblestone streets. Death was no stranger here. Consumption, fever, and accidents of the loom claimed lives with a cruel regularity. Yet the Prescott family, once known for their piety and modest fortune, would come to be remembered not for their lives, but for a photograph that seemed to breathe when it should have been still. Before we continue, make sure to subscribe so you never miss these haunting untold stories. The Prescott household stood on the edge of town, its wooden frame leaning as though bowing beneath invisible weight. Within it lived Samuel Prescott, a stern widower of 50, and his two daughters, Eleanor, aged 17, and Margaret, 15. They were known as quiet girls, pale and watchful, often seen in the shadow of their father, rarely in the company of others. Their mother had died years earlier of fever, leaving the sisters clinging to each other with a devotion that seemed almost spectral. Neighbors would recall how they often saw the sisters walking hand in hand through the mist that hung over the Merrimack River, whispering to one another in tones too hushed to hear. They were inseparable, and to those in town, inseparability carried with it an air of foreboding. The year brought with it a bitter winter. Snow heaped against the doorways and the mills fell silent for weeks. In that silence sickness grew. Fevers swept through homes, lungs filled with phlegm, and death carts rattled more than usual down the frozen streets. It was during these months that Eleanor, the elder sister, fell ill. At first it was a simple cough, dismissed by Samuel as weakness. But the cough deepened, hollow and rasping, stealing her breath. She paled, her cheeks sunken, her eyes glassy as though fixed on a distant horizon unseen by the rest. Margaret, devoted as ever, never left her side. She bathed her sister's brow with cold water, read her passages from the family Bible, and in the still of night, was heard weeping softly beside Eleanor's bed. By February, Eleanor's body wasted. The doctor, an aging man named Dr. Hawthorne, visited the home with his leather satchel, listened to her rattling breath and shook his head. Consumption, he said gravely. It would not be long. But in 1858, medicine walked hand in hand with error. The line between life and death was thinner than we now dare imagine. People were buried alive more often than records tell, their faint breaths mistaken for the stillness of death. Families, unaware, committed loved ones to the soil while the pulse of life yet lingered. On a morning soaked in frost, the Prescott home grew quiet. Samuel called for Dr. Hawthorne, who after a brief inspection, declared Eleanor dead. Her chest did not rise. Her lips were cold. Her heartbeat was too faint, too fragile to be caught by weary fingers. The family prepared for burial as custom dictated. A wake was held in the parlor, where Eleanor's body was laid in a simple pine coffin. Candles surrounded her, their flames casting long shadows across her still face. Margaret sat nearest, her hands trembling as she reached out to touch her sister's fingers, whispering that she was not truly gone. But Samuel hushed her. It is death, child. You must learn to accept it. And yet, those who attended the wake later swore that Eleanor's face looked less like the face of death, and more like the face of sleep. Her lips, parted slightly, seemed ready to speak. Her eyelids fluttered as though some faint dream stirred within. But no one dared voice it aloud. Death in those days was swift, cruel, and unquestionable. On the second night of mourning, a photographer was summoned. Post-mortem photography was a custom growing in popularity, a way to preserve memory when memory itself was fleeting. Death took too many too soon, and families clung to photographs as proof their loved ones had ever lived at all. The man who arrived was Mr. Alcott, a photographer with a portable daguerreotype camera. He was thin and severe, his fingers stained from chemicals, his eyes hollow from staring too often into death's reflection. He set up his camera by candlelight, the coffin carefully placed where shadows would not obscure the girl's face. Margaret refused to leave, watching every movement, her hands clutching at her dress as if to anchor herself in the room. When the plate was exposed and the image later developed, those present swore the photograph did not show Eleanor at rest. Her eyes, though closed in the coffin, appeared half open in the image. Her lips curved not downward but faintly upward, almost as though caught in a secret smile. The photograph unsettled all who saw it, but none more than Margaret, who clung to the print as proof that her sister was not gone, but lingering. After the burial, Margaret became restless. She began to dream strange dreams of her sister calling to her from beneath the soil. She spoke at night of faint scratching sounds, of muffled cries, of the photograph that seemed to breathe when no one watched. Samuel grew stern, warning her against hysteria. But the neighbors too began to whisper, of the Prescott girl who seemed too alive to have died, and of the sister who swore she still heard her in the silence of the house. And so it was that a shadow fell over the Prescott name. A shadow born not of death itself, but of the possibility that death had been mistaken, that Eleanor Prescott had been buried alive, and that the photograph was her proof, captured forever on a silver plate. Margaret, standing alone in the cold graveyard one evening, staring down at the mound of freshly packed earth where her sister lay. She pressed the photograph to her chest, whispering, "You're still there. I know it." And as the wind howled through the crooked trees, she swore she heard a faint sound in reply, like fingernails against wood. The graveyard was a lonely place in winter, but Margaret Prescott returned to it night after night. Snow crusted over the mounds, and the branches of the elms shivered in the wind, their bare arms rattling like bones. She carried the photograph always, hidden within her cloak, a secret relic she dared not show her father again. For Samuel Prescott had forbidden her mourning to go beyond prayer, forbidding tears, forbidding whispers. But grief cannot be silenced, and neither could the voice Margaret swore she heard from beneath the earth. At first the noises were faint. In her dreams, Eleanor's voice was a hush against the wind, calling her name. Then, even while awake, Margaret claimed to hear the same. A muffled cry, the scrape of fingernails, the dragging of breath through packed soil. Neighbors began to notice her wandering. Mrs. Albee, who lived nearest the Prescotts, told others that she had seen Margaret walking toward the cemetery at unholy hours, her nightdress hidden under a shawl, her bare feet pressing the snow. "She's bewitched," the woman whispered at Sunday service. "Or else her grief has cracked her mind in two." But whispers soon grew darker. For when some neighbors looked upon the photograph Mr. Alcott had taken, they too remarked on its strangeness. Eleanor's lips, parted so slightly, seemed to change expression when the light caught them. In one moment she appeared asleep, in another she seemed to smirk, her eyelids heavy as though resisting the weight of earth. More than one person swore they saw her lips curve wider when no one else was looking. Dr. Hawthorne dismissed the talk. "Grief invents illusions," he said gravely. "The girl is gone. Her sister must learn to rest." But Margaret could not rest. One evening, Samuel found her digging in the snow at Eleanor's grave with her bare hands, shivering violently. "I heard her," Margaret cried, her eyes wild. "She's calling for me." Samuel seized her and dragged her home, his face stern with shame. That night, the sound of his hand striking her cheek echoed through the house. Still Margaret persisted. She told her father that Eleanor was alive when they buried her, that the doctor had erred, that the photograph proved the truth. Samuel struck the photograph from her hands and locked it away in his study, swearing she would never see it again. Yet the photograph did not stay locked away. For 2 nights later, Samuel claimed he heard a sound from within his study, a rustle like paper shifting on its own. When he opened the drawer, the photograph lay atop the desk, though he swore he had locked it beneath. Eleanor's face, captured in silver, seemed sharper than before. Her lips parted wider, her eyes darker, her presence more insistent. Samuel, shaken, burned a candle beside it until dawn, unable to look away. The townsfolk's gossip deepened. Some whispered that Eleanor's soul had not departed, that she haunted her family from beneath the soil. Others muttered of curses, of a pact between the sisters that had reached beyond the grave. Then came the night that Margaret collapsed. Servants found her on the floor of her room, her fingernails broken and bloodied, clutched around a handful of dirt. Her lips murmured Eleanor's name, her breath ragged, her eyes glazed as though staring at something only she could see. Dr. Hawthorne declared it hysteria, a malady of women who suffer too much grief. But Margaret, when she regained strength, swore again, "She's not gone. She's waiting. We buried her alive." The town grew uneasy. Children whispered as they passed the Prescott house, and women avoided looking too long at Margaret in church, fearing the fever of her obsession might leap from her eyes into their own hearts. Then the gravedigger, old Thomas Doyle, added fuel to the fire. One evening at the tavern, drunk on rum, he confessed to hearing noises as he shoveled soil over Eleanor's coffin. At first he had dismissed it as shifting wood, but later, in his dreams, he swore he still heard the scratching. "I buried her, he slurred, "but I wonder if she weren't dead at all." The tale spread like fire. Within a week, townsfolk were gathering at the cemetery by candlelight, daring one another to press their ears to Eleanor's grave. Some swore they heard whispers. Others heard only silence, but silence too carries its own terror. Samuel Prescott, humiliated and enraged, demanded the gossip end. He forbade Margaret from leaving the house, locking the gates and posting a servant at her door. But Margaret's voice carried through the halls at night, chanting prayers that dissolved into pleas. "Eleanor, forgive us. Eleanor, come back." And in the shadows of the Prescott home, the photograph seemed to move again. Samuel, sleepless, returned often to his study only to find the image altered. Eleanor's eyes, once sealed, were open now, half-lidded, staring straight through the silver plate. Samuel tried to convince himself it was the trick of flame and shadow. But Margaret, desperate, found the photograph again, clutching it as she whispered, "She's trying to speak. Don't you see? Don't you hear?" By March, the entire town had become infected with unease. The Prescotts, once reserved but respected, were now spoken of in hushed tones as cursed. At the market, women crossed themselves when Margaret appeared. Children threw stones at the house and ran screaming. And in the tavern, Doyle's words grew bolder. "I tell ye, I buried a living soul. And mark me, she'll not rest." As frost gave way to thaw, the earth loosened. The cemetery ground, once frozen solid, grew soft with mud. It was then Margaret begged her father to exhume the coffin. "Please," she whispered, her hands clasped. "If I'm wrong, let the truth silence me. But if I'm right." Samuel refused. But Margaret's words did not fade. They crept into his mind, into his dreams. He, too, began to wake in the night to faint scratching, though whether it came from beneath the soil or from within his own head, he could not say. The town pressed closer, their whispers heavier, their eyes sharper. And one night, Margaret swore she saw Eleanor herself standing by her bedside, pale, thin, her dress stained with earth, her lips curving into that same secret smile the photograph had captured. When she screamed, the household rushed to her door. But no one else saw the figure. Only Margaret, trembling, pointing into the corner where the shadows clung. And so, suspicion became something darker, something that clawed not just at the mind of Margaret Prescott, but at the very soul of the town. By April of 1858, the Prescott home had become a mausoleum of whispers. Servants refused to sleep indoors, choosing instead to huddle in the barns. Neighbors passed by quickly, some crossing to the other side of the road, others muttering prayers under their breath. Even the church bells, when they tolled, seemed to echo more darkly in the air around the Prescott estate, as though warning the living of a secret beneath their feet. Samuel Prescott, once a man of reason, now walked with trembling hands. The photograph tormented him. Each time he returned to his study, Eleanor's image had shifted again. Her lips parted wider, her eyes clearer, her hand, once folded against her chest, now pressed flat against the coffin's interior. The family portrait was no longer a token of grief. It was a record of something unspeakable. Margaret grew gaunt, her cheeks hollow, her lips cracked from whispering prayers into the night. Her father forbade her visits to the cemetery, yet she no longer needed to go. Eleanor's presence had crossed the boundary between earth and home. Margaret felt her sister's breath against her ear as she slept, cold and damp with soil. She felt the tug at her hair in the darkness, the scraping of nails across her window glass. Finally, one evening, Margaret took matters into her own hands. She stole her father's keys and crept to the graveyard, lantern in hand. The thaw had softened the ground. She clawed at the earth with desperation, her lantern swinging wildly, its light catching the eyes of those who watched from the shadows. For she was not alone. Neighbors had followed, their curiosity now fevered by months of rumor. The crowd swelled as Margaret dug, her fingers raw, the shovel striking wood. "She's here," she cried, her voice breaking. "I'll prove it." Samuel arrived too late. The coffin had already been pried open. The stench of earth and decay filled the air, but what lay within silenced the gathering. Eleanor Prescott's body was not at peace. Her face bore the marks of terror, her mouth frozen open in a silent scream, her fingers splintered and bloodied from clawing at the lid. The coffin's interior was scratched with desperate marks, each line a plea etched into wood. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. Women fainted. Men crossed themselves. Even Samuel's knees buckled beneath him as he stared upon the proof of what his daughter had cried all along. Margaret fell to the earth, wailing. "I told you. She lived. You buried her alive." Her cries rose with the wind, carrying into the night like a curse. The townsfolk recoiled. The Prescotts were no longer merely whispered about, they were damned. Mothers dragged their children away, fathers muttered of divine punishment, and all turned their backs on the family they now believed haunted. Samuel demanded the coffin be reburied, insisting the evidence be hidden. But secrets, once unearthed, do not return to silence. The photograph circulated, passed in secret hands from home to home. Each who looked upon it swore the image changed before their eyes. Eleanor's expression grew darker, her eyes more insistent, her mouth curling into something between grief and accusation. By midsummer, tragedy deepened. Samuel Prescott was found in his study, slumped over his desk, the photograph clutched in his stiffened hand. His face was twisted, his eyes wide with terror, as though he had seen his daughter standing before him at last. Margaret alone survived in the house. But survival is not peace. She roamed its halls barefoot, whispering to her sister, the photograph never leaving her side. When neighbors peered through the windows, they swore they saw two shadows moving across the candlelit rooms, though only one body remained in the living world. The Prescott estate soon fell to ruin. Vines crawled across its walls, shutters beat hollow against the wind, and dust swallowed the halls. The townsfolk avoided it, their children warned never to approach. Yet some claimed to hear faint scratching if they passed too near, as though the soil itself remembered what had been done. And still the photograph endures. Its whereabouts are whispered of even now, said to have been found in an antique shop a century later, the face of Eleanor Prescott still shifting beneath the glass. Some who gazed too long into her eyes claimed to hear the muffled cries of a girl buried alive, clawing not at wood but at the very soul of whoever dares to look. What silence lingers when a coffin hides more than death? For in the tale of the Prescott sisters, silence was never silence at all, it was the sound of a scream smothered by earth, and a secret that refuses even in death to be buried. If this story chilled you, don't forget to like this video and subscribe our channel. It helps us bring more forgotten tales to light.